history is something that is like extremely like buried and something that's happened in the past. Not even the best historian or like not the most well-rounded scholar can really get a complete sense of history. This larger Indian trend of like keeping history as some kind of a marker for how we're going to see our future, like that is definitely a very worrying trend, because then a focus on that is very rarely a focus away from our material conditions today, which are like the more reliable markers of like what kind of a future we want or we desire.
India is a country with a long and storied history. It's the largest democracy and fifth largest economy in the world as of late 2025. So what happens in Indian politics increasingly affects the rest of the world. But many Indian politicians approach decision making not in terms of present day India, but India as it used to exist, or rather as they imagine it used to exist. So today I'm joined by Satwik Gade to discuss how Indian history affects current national politics. Satwik, thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
You specialize in satire, specifically cartoons. Can you give us a quick rundown of your work?
I used to work for one of the largest newspapers here called the Hindu. I used to do editorial cartoons, comics, graphic stories, as well as political cartoons. And yeah, it was a newspaper that my politics really aligned with. So I grew up reading the newspaper. I grew up admiring the works of the satirists in the newspaper. And then I was lucky enough to kind of grow up, go work there, and I worked under two of the best cartoonists, I would say, in the country, and learned the craft from them.
I want to talk to you about, from your experience as a satirist, as a cartoonist, and working in journalism in India, your perspective on Indian politics, but especially as we spoke before this episode about how Indian politics is shaped so heavily by how politicians in India understand the history of the country and the narratives that they form around what the country should be and in which direction it should go. So if I've got that correct, I was curious if you can first, to start, because I want to understand also the politics just at a basic level, if you can kind of take us through a quick rundown of the major political parties of India. So, what are they? What are their major platforms? Groups of people that tend to vote for them.
America has two large national parties. And in a sense, India also has two major blocks in Indian politics. One is called the BJP, which is the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is uh, sort of a little more right of center, you would say. And there is the Congress, Indian National Congress Party, which is kind of the more say liberal wing of Indian politics. And apart from that, there are also other national parties. But also, what happens in India is the parties which are popular at the state level, and these are in the hundreds, because we have about 35 plus states and several union territories. And so, the number of political parties that are strong in those domains, just like number in the hundreds. And we have something called coalition politics in India, like where the government is formed by a group of these parties. So now when BJP forms government in the center, they form a government under this umbrella of NDA, which is National Democratic Alliance, under which BJP as well as several other regional parties that kind of want to form a coalition with them come under that grouping. So in 2003, 2008, we had a Indian National Congress led government, which would be called the United Progressive Alliance, and then like they would have a coalition government of various state parties with the Indian National Congress kind of leading the pack. So that's typically how coalition politics in India works. Apart from that, we have a large national level party called the Bahujan Samaj Party, or BSP. The term Bahujan typically means you could call them like say depressed classes or like marginalized classes. So Bahujan literally means people who work with their bahu is like shoulders or arms. So like people who do heavy work, um, and this has traditionally been also like one of the factors. Apart from you know uh, caste being divided on puritanical lines, it's also divided on the lines of division of labor and what kind of labor which classes are expected to perform. The preferred term for the oppressed classes in India is Bahujan, which they take it as a term of pride because that's the kind of work that they do. It's similar to what you would say working class, but the class is different from caste in that sense because there's also endogamy and various other things that come.
I'm curious to get a sense of like where, let's say, they would differ in terms of their platforms, or even more broadly, the groups of people that might generally, let's say, vote for them. Based on caste, based on geographical region, men versus women, rich versus poor. All of those kind of not every breakdown, but those sorts of breakdowns.
Sure, yeah. So honestly speaking, I must say, we're in a sort of very transitionary phase in Indian politics where it's becoming harder and harder to kind of draw these lines. And I do want to also
Okay.
that might be. But broadly speaking, yes, minority groups as well as women have traditionally preferred Congress and Congress-like politics. Like Congress has also had some very strong women leaders, like the first woman Prime Minister of India, Ms. Indira Gandhi. You do tend to have minorities and women supporting Indian National Congress more, and BJP does tend to be the voice of sort of the more you could call it like traditional conservative, more Hindu male, and Hindus make up nearly 80% of Indian population. So it's not like Hindus vote en masse as a vote bank or something like that. But at the same time, Hindu males generally tend to be more pro BJP. This is a kind of generalized experience I'm giving, at least like this is something that I experienced as well as my friends and all that. That typically in a household, you'll have the mothers and the grandmothers kind of like go vote for Congress, and then the fathers and the grandfathers kind of go vote for BJP, and that's kind of roughly how it works, unless the entire family is kind of like aligned politically in my.
While you could say it's a generalization, one would make a similar generalization about, let's say, American politics, which is men will vote Republican more than women. And while that's a generalization, it is also statistically true. So it's yeah, and I hate to sort of paint with these broad brushes where I say the BJP is like the Republicans and the Indian National Congress is like the Democrats, and I'm curious actually to see that I'm sure they have very different policies in certain areas that don't align at all with what people in the U.S. are concerned with, or other, let's say, European countries, which I'm also curious about too. Like, what are some of the very divisive topics where it's clear that these two parties have very different worldviews in terms of how they see India, how they see the future, how they see the past, how they think of themselves.
So to give a little bit of a history of India, so 200 years of colonization, and even before 200 years of colonization, the sort of like the broader empire that was in India, there were a few major empires, the Mughals and the Marathas, and a few other large empires. But out of these, um, the dominant trend in India for about 1,000 years has been mainly Islamic-based governments. Mughals were Central Asians. Before that we had Afghans and Turks sort of ruling in India. And again, like there is a lot of mixed, varied history about like how these governments sort of went and to what level did they really sort of like control day-to-day lives of people and all of that, so on and so forth. But the broader narrative that the BJP sort of speaks about is about like this kind of lost Hindu pride, which a lot of writers have compared to this European idea of resentment that started around the that started in the maybe like 19th century in especially Germany, Italy, and other places, which we later see kind of we tend to see it as a proto-fascist ideology in this day and age. But around the same time in India, like these were the same ideas that were gaining force, and something like the Hindu Mahasabha got formed, which was basically trying to address this issue. And very interestingly, like this was at the height of colonial struggle, but at the same time, what the Hindu Mahasabha was fighting for was kind of not um, freedom from the British per se, but they were kind of very paranoid about the idea that an Islamic government is going to come back, or that like there would be a non-Hindu government getting formed in India. So these were the kind of anxieties that the Hindu Mahasabha had. Meanwhile, you had the Congress, which also got created around the same time, Indian National Congress, like which was
And this is like early 1900s, 1920s ish kind of.
no more like let's say 1880s. Alan Octavian Hume, I think. So it was even technically started by an Indian man. It was started by a Britisher, because again, like Congress also has this history of like having started as a party that's part of, this kind of a political quid pro quo kind of a thing. There were a lot of very wealthy Indians as well as very wealthy Britishers who had an interest in India being administered and governed a little better than it was being, like, in the old colonial style, it was almost being looted, so to speak. And instead, like, they wanted to have a very administered India that would still serve British interests, of course, but also develop as a country on its own, and that these broader democratic ideals that the government should Indian government should have its own. There should be an Indian government which is also kind of tempered by the British Parliament, kind of an idea. So this is how the Indian National Congress started. So very interestingly, like basically, like neither of these parties were really fighting for complete Indian freedom, as we later, like as the goals sort of changed as it went forward. But this is sort of where it was. Like then, in 1925, a couple of new entities became formed, which is the Communist Party of India and RSS, Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which means like uh, it was like sort of like a youth wing uh, so of the Hindu Mahasabha, with like slightly different ideals, saying that like like they are not interested in electoral politics, but more into civic politics. But at the same time, they kind of form the substratum of BJP. Even right now, like all of BJP's regional level, organizational level activities are overseen and kind of to a great extent informed by the ideas that are forming in the RSS. So with the RSS and the Communist Party of India getting formed in around 1925, the political landscape also started changing. So yeah, so the larger political question even today seems to be divided along the lines of like what is it that an Indian is sort of like fighting against? Like is it the more um, was it colonialism back in the day? Is it like this Western style neo-imperialism today? Is that what we're kind of like worried about? Or are we worried about things that are more on the religious lines? Like, are we worried about, sort of Hindu ideals being diluted? And like the fear is basically of, say like Islamic ideas of social of community, or like say Christian ideas of community, are these kind of like dominating over like the Hindu ideas of community. So this is the broad sort of fault line, like like whether you kind of like question um, Western imperialism, or do you question like other forms of like sort of religious secularism that you feel is kind of what in the US you guys call like cultural Marxism, right? Like cultural Marxism is this kind of like fear.
My sense from the outside, that if I had to guess, is, and I'm curious if I'm close on this, is, let's say, British imperialism slash the West, and then Islam would be two major categories that different factions within India view as the hostile thing that we're the most worried about. And I could imagine that in the case of the Indian National Congress, I'm actually not sure. I'm curious about that. But the sense I have from the BJP is they're viewing increasingly more like Islam as the main threat, and the West is something that we can certainly do business with. We can deal with the West. We're not going to be best friends with them, but we're willing to entertain them if it helps our interests, but we view Islam, and especially the as we see it, the subjugation of Hindu India by Islam for centuries, as a major point that gives us a feeling of like grievance.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Like, yeah, that is a broad based. Again, like, like we were
And it's
talking.
very broad based, but like if we had to summarize it, like
Yeah, yeah. If we had to summarize it, those would be the large streams in which the thinking kind of goes, and it also kind of depends on how people are responding to these thoughts, and the response to these thoughts also tends to come along these lines. Like you have people from the BJP who are kind of like trying to evoke memories of temples being destroyed, like in the name of like Islamic revolution, like say in the past, like that's what they're trying to like sort of remind you about. And then you have like politicians from the Indian National Congress, some of the more popular, articulate ones, who are talking about the Great Bengal famine, which was effectively created by the British just through like bad economic policies and through like literally not caring, like where your administration is only based on kind of extraction and not so much on the basis of anything else.
I'm actually curious about that in terms of the Indian National Congress. So, and I think maybe it's just because Narendra Modi, he's in the news a bit more, and I've tracked a little bit more the sense of when I read about the BJP, kind of what seems to be the theme, the through line. But the Indian National Congress, I don't have as much of a sense about who do they view as sort of the big historical villains? Do they take more of a not to generalize here with like let's say the Democrats in the US, but this surface level, we want to be friends with everyone, we're all humans around planet Earth approach, or is it this very much we want to be nice, we want to play nice with the Muslims, and it's the evil British who are the villains of the story?
I think what the Congress is sort of facing right now is that they don't seem to have like a very clear narrative from this point of view. There are definitely many politicians uh, who do take this stance that, like, yes, it's Western style imperialism that we kind of like need to be worried about and all that. But I don't know if that gives a lot of traction with the current day electoral politics, because certainly, unless you're able to contextualize colonialism in terms of present day neoliberalism, it's very hard to make people understand why it is that we must resist Western imperialism or something. So what the sense that I get is that, like, yes, the Congress does try to do this, but they don't kind of dwell on it too much because it doesn't give them results. Because what they are very against doing, and this is again, I think, like something that the left or the Communist Party is much more free about sort of saying, which is to question neoliberalism itself. But the Indian National Congress tends to not question neoliberalism so much because they are liberal in ideology. And what I mean by liberalism is basically to the extent to which one would want to link Indian economy with the larger global economy, which is is sort of largely shaped by what we call the Washington Consensus. And I think this is a problem that a lot of the global South faces today, which is that again we are all coming back to speaking about our ideologies and like the politics that happen in the country along religious lines. Typically, this would not have happened, like say, like 25 years ago. Like the conversations were very much a lot more along the lines of, oh, do we liberalize the economy? The like, economy has become too liberal. Like now do we like sort of pull back? Like, was it better when we had like more regulations? Is it better like when there's like more free market and all that? And slowly these questions around the market and around the economy started decreasing, because essentially like what happens is as an economy becomes more and more dependent on the global economy, then what you can do in terms of your economic spending comes to be decided more and more through what is known as like debt restructuring that is suggested by the International Monetary Fund as well as the World Bank, and what we call as the Washington Consensus again, which is broadly like the World Bank, IMF, and Ford Foundation and a few other like large banks, which together sort of decide that, hey, this is how the global debt is looking like right now, and therefore, and the global debt is sort of, like the indebted countries or the global south, and then like we'll sort of, and the way the debt economy works is that like the countries need to keep borrowing. So if the countries need to keep borrowing, then you can sort of say that, hey, these are the conditions under which you can borrow. You can continue to borrow if your repayment looks like this, or if we see you spend money on XYZ in your countries. So basically, what happens in India as a result, what happens in many countries around the world as a result, is that there is only so many ways in which a politician or your leaders can shape your economy. It is broadly decided at a very non-electoral stage. And I'm not saying like this that this is happening in the traditional imperialist style. Like if you look at it, like the the heads of IMF, people who are at influential positions in World Bank, are Indians. World Bank and IMF view India in a very favorable way. Like happy to give loans all the time at in conditions that seem very lenient compared to other countries and all that. But I'm again describing a broader trend when it comes to the global south, is that like what happens as a result of this sort of economic planning, as we call it, is that the matters of economy tend to go out of electoral hands, which is why it was so hard for me to kind of like tell you like, hey, this is what the Congress does, this is what the BJP does, because it's not that easy. Because no matter whether it's BJP coming to the center, or Congress coming to the center, like the things that people would typically care about have already been decided. Like that's going to be the same. Like we see today you can look at the Narendra Modi government and sort of say he's selling away public resources to private interests, is uh, enforcing or like kind of like easing the extraction of natural resources, his easing pollution of waters and all of that. But these are not exclusive to the Narendra Modi government. Like these were things that started in the previous Congress government. Like Narendra Modi is only kind of like reaping the quote unquote benefits of of kind of like these floodgates that were already opened by a previous political party, which is supposedly the opposite of what Narendra Modi is, right? Like, and at this point, like we really start to question, like, are they really that different from each other at all? And from an economic point of view, no. And if you again, if we come to the question of like, why is it that people care about India in the past and not so much India in the present, is because India in the present has been taken out of electoral hands. This is being decided in the higher echelons of power. It is being done through negotiations, diplomacy, trade, and summits, so on and so forth. Like it's not like an average Indian like me gets to vote on these issues. So say you remove all of the economic scaffolding on the basis of which I can vote, then what remains for me is some idea of like cultural grandeur and like like cultural pride and things that I can look up to, not as immediate material economic interests, but as so sort of these broader based ideas which give me some kind of like a mental or emotional soothing. And so and so when we say that like religious lines voting is happening, or like the ideas are happening on religious lines, I also want to kind of emphasize that this is not happening by choice. It is not like Indians are particularly, I mean, it would come off right now that Indians are extremely obsessed with religion, and Indians are extremely obsessed with their past, and like they keep digging up the past and all that. But this is not. This is by design. It's not by choice. Is what I'd like to say.
The point about the IMF and the World Bank and all these entities and the difference between that and the population is very interesting, because I'm thinking, especially with a lot of, and this is not just even the US, but we'll call it the broader and like the broader core Western countries, there's becoming this very similar theme, which is the people feel completely disenfranchised from the governments, which seem to be following the orders of these higher entities, irrespective of whatever the people are voting for. And on top of that, when you mentioned, look, there are rich Indian people who are now part of all of these entities. It also gets to this theme of, I think of India more and more as, I don't want to say there aren't obviously huge elements that make it part of the global south, but there are also elements that I'm starting to see it as being its own thing. And partly that is because it is now the fifth largest economy in the world. There are now a lot of rich people in India, and there is now more agency amongst people in that country, at least again amongst the very elite, to make policy and to affect how things are playing out in the world. And I guess I just think it's interesting to see that there is a similar underlying current of anger that's growing amongst a lot of people in India, the same way it's very palpable in Western countries, about this notion of like these unelected people who are almost just like, we don't even know who they are. They're just these shadowy people that just control stuff that like why? Like how? Like why are these things happening?
Absolutely. And I think whether it's in the India or in the US, like I think like the anger is kind of like being diverted a little bit on dominant majoritarian religious lines a lot more.
Sure.
So because when these shadowy figures at the top are like doing these things that we don't know what it is, it can very easily be, and this is happening a lot in the India as well as the US, saying that like, hey, look at us, we are like the kind of ground level religious God fearing folk, who would never do anything wrong, and then there are these shadowy figures who've like kind of like gotten out of bounds of religious and cultural control, and they kind of like they become too big, too powerful, and they're kind of like doing these ungodly things up there in the center. And of course, the very politicians that you vote for are very much part of those cabals and all of that. But you don't see it that way. Like the narrative has come out in such a way that it is these broader intellectual class, or like the elite classes, that are like doing all of this stuff, while the more the simple minded, god fearing, like regular folk are being sort of becoming part of these broader designs, which I must say is very much the truth, except not the truth in the way that popular narrative kind of like tends to front it as like a very clear religious question or a cultural question or a past versus present kind of.
If I think about it like 30 years ago, the idea would be these organizations, these global organizations were, I would imagine, very correctly seen as sort of a tool of like shadowy Western imperialism, where it was still being used as a way to kind of, keep the global South down through all of these practices. And what's interesting is to see that from how you're describing it, the narrative reminds me very much more of, again, like a contemporary Western narrative, where the ire is increasingly going to the same large organization. It's not even so much, it's the US or, it's Britain or whatever. It's like, no, it's the IMF, like they're behind it all. Is there a difference, let's say, between the BJP and the Indian National Congress in how they might think about this? Because certainly in the US and even Europe, the general stereotype is the sort of neoliberal left of center parties are all in the category of like, this is great, this is fine, what are you talking about? There's not a problem. And the very like kind of right-wing parties are, the World Health Organization's behind it all. And that's kind of increasingly becoming a lot of the rhetoric you're hearing.
Broadly, what they're saying becomes kind of similar, because it is the political parties like BJP and Congress which are very happy with how the sort of debt restructuring programs happen, and the kind of like loans that we're able to access from the IMF and World Bank, and all of the stuff is something that is very essential to how India is run today. So like the people who are in power sort of tend to be very happy with these arrangements. They're trying to go for more neoliberalism in the country, but at the same time, the left wing is kind of resisting this sort of a thing, which you see happening in the American right wing a little bit more.
Even with the American left and the American right, and even broadly, I'll throw in not every Western, well, at this point, actually, pretty much almost every Western European country too, is you're seeing factionalism even amongst that, and there can be sort of there's like the authoritarian drive, and then there's sort of the like left and right drive, and so there are elements of the American right that can be very like small government, free market. We want people we'll just have the market do everything, and government should just sort of sit off to the side, versus much more authoritarian kind of approaches. And that's, critics of Trump usually paint him that way. They paint MAGA as a very the more authoritarian aspect of the American right wing. But on the left too, like the far left increasingly in the U.S., it's probably fair to say, would probably share a fair amount in common with, let's say, like the Indian Communist Party in their worldview of, it's the neoliberals that are the ones that are causing us all of the harm and all of the suffering. And but it's just because since the U.S. just has these two big blocks, they're getting so confusing now with all of the different little sub factions in the Democrats and the Republicans. It's really hard to. In my personal opinion, at some point they really, if you could just divide them, be like, all right, U.S., we're gonna have like 6 parties now. It would be easier to map this stuff out. But that idea, actually, you said, I get that the flip side is always the problem is like coalition governments never get it much done. And it's always impossible to accomplish anything because you have we have these 4 different factions that we have to corral together to convince them to get this like one bill passed or whatever. Do you have a sense of just whether daily life or whatnot, people's feelings about the current state of politics in India?
I think this is a much better place, or like a more reliable place to kind of like draw the fault line, which is to say that whichever side of the political spectrum someone might lie on, whether they might at a particular election vote for BJP or another election vote for the Congress or like whatever it is, like the broader thinking, if you look at it, is divided along the lines of like, do you want a more authoritarian government? Do you want a government that is able to kind of like like pull people by the scruff and kind of like like get decisions made, pass bills, sign agendas? Like, is that who you want, or do you want less of that? That is sort of a much better question, because like I feel, at least like I can see the broader worldview amongst Indians being divided along these lines. Like, do we want more authoritative governments? And like people might say that Modi is bad and somebody else should come in, but is that somebody else like who you want them to be? Like are you saying that that person should be more authoritative than Modi? Like because there is even um, concern on the right wing that like Modi is not being as authoritative as it could be, like, which is a bit of a joke for people who don't think along those lines, like who feel Modi is already being very authoritative, right? Like, so this is the broader thing also, that like like what is the degree of legitimacy that we give to the government, and what level of authority do we think is a kind of an authority that the government is allowed to sort of take into its hands. And in this point of view, yes, definitely, like we have a larger trend in India, which goes towards like authoritarianism, like where we feel that India has to progress, has to develop, and has to do this rapidly. And in order to do that, like we need more authoritative structures sort of coming in. And that, I think, is like a broader sentiment that runs across party lines. And then you have the sort of broader grassroots level activist communities. You have the like public health workers and all of that, like who sort of feel the everyday effects of a government being authoritative and strong, because what they tend to believe is that the government is just like this kind of a broader scaffolding that exists around our society, like which is there for like certain central administrative purposes. But the actual democracy, the actual work happens by ground level actors, like irrespective of whether there is a government or not. So essentially, what happens when a stronger authoritative government gets formed is that like these activities, the government starts interfering in these activities, which otherwise kind of would have been going on by themselves, right? Like, so then the question comes in, is like, do you want a weak coalition government like that cannot really like do much, that is just kind of like just about holding fort at the top? So is that a better place for the rest of the society to be, wherein you have a central administrative apparatus that is kind of holding things together, but it is not so powerful that it can kind of affect what is happening at a decentralized level? Or is it that you feel that like the central power, or like a kind of a central planning and sort of a national level uh, consensus on how the entire country should be shaped in progress? Like, is that what you sort of want? And even right now, that is the division along like left wing and right wing lines in India. I think like right wing is for that kind of a authoritarianism. Right wing is for that kind of like, hey, all of India should be doing what one of India is kind of like doing: one nation, one election, one language, one economic agenda. Everything has to be like one, and kind of like and the government right now also like talks about this like double engine government where there is, so this is BJP's idea of like kind of like reproducing, which it says that like, hey, if there's a BJP government in the center, like make sure you have a BJP government in the state, because then you have two engines working towards the exact same goals. Whereas the left wing narrative tends to be the opposite. That like yes, you have a BJP government in the center, which means that we need to be. Uh, that means that the state government suddenly needs to become like a kind of a force of resistance against what it sees as a kind of a more centralized Hindi-based imperialism that is sort of happening within the country. So like that becomes the basis of left and right now in India, and like that I think is a little more reliable because um, there are many non-religious people, purely atheistic, driven by like whatever like science and like all of that stuff, who believe very strongly in authoritarianism. They believe that like like a centralized planned agenda by the intellectual elites with like proper planning and like proper vision and like ruthless enforcement is going to get us to wherever it is that we imagine we want to get at. And then there is the left, which kind of like says that yes, it is the tendency of a government to always be that, and then it is a duty of the civil society or all of these like other broader grassroots movements to kind of always resist that, and to kind of and then in that case like uh, if you cannot have a government that is more left of center, then what you want at least is a kind of a peak coalition government that doesn't steamroll over or like bulldoze their plans.
A lot of that makes sense, and I can see the appeals in kind of both cases. I mean, especially as I said, the fact that I don't view India as as it was, let's say, in the the 70s, where it's like, oh, it's this global South country and it's a place of suffering, and the the British looted things, and but I view it as an ascendant power. And with ascendant powers, there's often this idea of, once we know there's momentum behind making our nation great, that becomes this very appealing idea for a lot of people to get behind. Like, we're on the up and up, and we want to climb the mountain further and beat out our competitors. And the only way we can do that is if we get behind a strong, powerful, well-run government that gets us to where we need to go. Then on the other hand, the idea of, well, you have, as the country's gotten wealthier and as it's become more powerful, like in any place, right, the wealth inequality has gotten even worse. My understanding is, from where it was. There, of course, are real concerns about authoritarian governments, and the fact that India is a democracy is an important thing to keep in mind. And if you go too far down the path of, we have to have our our empire, we need to rebuild our empire, or as we understand it. I mean that more metaphorically. That it's important to say, like, no, there are very major pitfalls if we go down that route. That many countries have gone down that route, and it often has not ended well for them. And so we have to remember that, like, we do have these liberal elements in how we run. Like, we are not China. We're not, Iran. We're not Russia. We are our own thing, and we have to remember that.
Yeah, and that really brings us back to the religious angle that we were talking about earlier, because
Yes.
um, recent contemporary politics would tell us about the dangers of, like, say, the Soviet trying to be this one nation, one language, like one government sort of a thing, and then like that kind of like has this, I mean, like again, the West or the US would like to see the crumbling of the Soviet as like some kind of a victory of like capitalism and all that. Like, but if you look at history, essentially it's the Soviets' own authoritative policies and the fact that like it tried to weave together these entirely different cultures under this united Russian ideal that kind of like leads to the crumbling of the Soviet and like the breaking up of the thing. And so it is with so many other countries. Even like China, we might see it as this like kind of a cohesive force and all that, but they have their own problems simply because of the same thing, like which is trying uh, to push forward this united agenda and all of that. So contemporary politics can very much tell us all of the pitfalls of kind of trying to push this like unitarian united agenda. But this is where the religious politics comes in. But what if say you had this rich and varied history where a text from 5,000 years ago like tells you about this like united continent where the same law, the same dharma kind of like existed like everywhere. Like now this place is defined by a term, by a Sanskrit word that they use, but you could very easily imagine today that it refers to the whole of the Indian subcontinent. And you can imagine that in the past there was this united Indian subcontinent which was running by like one people, one law, one language. Again, like no, I'm not saying there's historical evidence to credit any of these ideas, but
Oh, sure. This is a narrative. Yeah, this is a
yeah,
historical
correct,
narrative. Yeah.
correct. Because it is very true that like India does have access to these like extremely ancient texts. Like for instance, like some of the some of Indian scriptures are the earliest liturgical material that is available anywhere in the world. And think about like liturgy is essentially rituals related to the running of a state or a kingdom or something like so today we speak about running of a state or a kingdom through the constitution and through more secular means and all that. But in the past, religion and the running of the state were sort of like mixed up, and that is basically what is like liturgy and like like these sacrifices, like how to conduct a sacrifice so that like your kingdom would be prosperous and wealthy, and the sacrificial rites have a kind of a redistributive apparatus. A kind of a redistributive apparatus that we sort of speak about today, like which is the broader economy and all of that. Like so like when you have a, these kind of like ancient texts that hint at economic planning, that hint at economic well-being, but at the same time are very heavily religious-based texts. It is very easy. It is very tempting to kind of believe in this narrative that if the idea of sort of a very decentralized and a kind of like a very drip by drip incremental progress is not anybody's first choice. So like the moment anybody says like, hey, but this sort of like an authoritarian government is kind of like very dangerous, you can immediately point to this past and say that like, hey, no, but like look at this text. This talks about a period of time when India was united. It was there was so and so king who was like super authoritarian. He killed all of these other kings, like fought all of these wars, emerged victorious, and he let the let dharma, or like the rule of the land, like sort of unfold. And as this text says, like everybody was happy. Like there was so much wealth, and in a sense, this is not purely built on like un like like it's not purely imaginative because like until the um, colonial period, until the 16th century, India was uh, the world's largest economy in the ancient world. India was sort of like this. There's a lot of talk nowadays of like Indosphere, which is essentially like how the US right now is the cultural capital of the world, so to speak. Like US is where the broader cultural ideas like emanate from. So in the same way, in ancient times, like India and China, and there was uh, sort of a broader fight between like India and China about who was ascendant at which point of time, but it was broadly India and China sort of like uh, you know spreading their culture. So like whether you look at like all of government is now based on paper replication. Like you write something down on paper, like replicate it, and then like you have these like elaborate bureaucracies on the basis of which like government is run. But that is, if you go back in ancient history, that is Chinese bureaucracy. Like that kind of a bureaucracy did not exist in any other part of the ancient world. It is a Chinese form of bureaucracy that we kind of like adopted as a broader democratic ideal. Like whether it was the French Revolution or American Revolution, like all of these like picked up these ideas from Arabic and Turkish countries, and Arabic and Turkish countries had picked it up from China because of the Silk Road, where these ideas were like passing through and all of that. So there was a period of time when the Eastern world was the sort of center of all of these cultural ideas, was the center of the global economy, was the center of trade. So you, it is very easy to kind of have this mixed, like a little bit of history, but a little bit but a good measure of fantasy thrown in to kind of like imagine this glorious past.
The other dynamic, and it's I guess not quite on politics, but it's another one of these interesting trends that I see that lines up between India, but also China, and then sort of let's call it Europe, Western Europe, is the creation of the fantasy of there's enough evidence that at one point in time in the past we were the dominant power, and then at another point in time we were not the dominant power, and so we can always fall back on, well, we are the best because at least during this period we were great. And then we hit the dark ages, or we hit a rough patch, we hit colonization or whatever it was that sort of knocked us down, but that wasn't our fault. And so that's why we got to get back up the mountain. But this actually, I want to delve in a little history more here, which is, we touched on at the beginning the different narratives that the two sides have, and how, broadly speaking, current day, let's say BJP takes more of a, like Islam's the main threat. Indian National Congress, it's a bit more complicated. Are there clear perspectives or takes that the major parties have on, like, let's say the Gupta dynasty, or like the Muslim invasions, or the Mughals, or the British, where they're like pretty much like that party has a view of X? And I'm just thinking, let's take in the US, like Columbus Day versus Indigenous Peoples Day. That's a very clear split based on if it's like Democrats or Republicans, where there's essentially a mainline political consensus on this version of this historical thing versus this other version of the same historical thing. And I'm wondering if we can do the same for like certain key periods in Indian history that, like, it's there's a hard split.
There is definitely no clear idea of who is the oppressor from any point of view, really, because of something very interesting that happens in terms of the role that British played when they came to India. So when they came to India, like, they were looking at kind of um, a society that was divided on the lines of something called caste. Again, caste is a word that is a European word. Something like caste existed in Spain and Portugal and in other places, and that was the term that Britishers used to describe the system that was there in India. But essentially, like, what they saw was like a society segregated by status, and now, so what happens is that British play this like very interesting dual game. So on the one hand, in order to gain administrative control over India, what they do is they liken themselves more and more to the Brahmins, which is the upper end of the caste spectrum.
The priestly ruling
Yeah,
caste.
priestly. I mean, like, we keep talking about how they're priestly, but they're also the accountants and the money lenders. So they are sort of the economic planners as well, like, not just the priests. So the so there is this idea of trying to get not just the Brahmins. There are also some other castes also which form this part of, like, the accounting administrative system. They are also the people who are really quick to switch over to new language. So, like, say the Britishers come within like a couple of generations, these groups of people would have learned enough English. So they were called like Dubashis, which is like they have their translators or interlocutors, like, who kind of like speak two languages and all that. Like, there were always like castes that were more, sort of saw benefit in kind of like doing that. Like, so there is the Britishers kind of um working with the upper castes to kind of set up an administrative apparatus. But at the same time, the Britishers are also like fighting local rulers and like local governments. And over here, like, what it happens is that there is there's the most depressed classes of the Indian society, currently called the Dalits, who were earlier, like, like, considered forest people or
They
criminal
were called
tribes,
the untouchables,
the
as
untouchables,
they
and
used
like
to be known. Yeah.
either criminalized from a legal standpoint, or they were oppressed from a social standpoint. Like, either way, the bar is always this, that like certain social privileges are not available to them. In fact, like the very idea of a social privilege comes to exist because like some things are like not allowed for them, whereas they're allowed for everybody else, right? Like, and this sort of and this is something that is so incredibly it relates so well to the US as well, that like you might wonder that uh how is it that we find like so many African Americans in the army kind of like fighting for America. And once again, like the army tends to be a little bit supremacist, and like the government itself, like at the armed force level, tends to be a bit authoritarian. And how is it that you find like African Americans like filling in the ranks so much? And same way, like when British came to India, like in order to fight Indian rulers, what they did was recruit from the Dalit classes, basically. And suddenly the Dalit classes who were social got a standing, got a status in the Indian society. Like a lot of Dalit leaders who became part of the Indian freedom struggle, they were able to educate themselves. Like they were first generation educated, but they were the first generation educated only because their parents joined the British Army, and suddenly they got access to education in military schools. They suddenly got access to education that they were otherwise denied, and all of these things, sort of started happening. And this is something that interests me a lot in the way that imperialism kind of operates, where it operates at two levels, which is why it becomes so difficult to kind of like question it very directly, right? Like just imagine that the British had only formed a coalition with the Brahmins and said like we are just going to administer this country, and then you could have had something like a very simplified version of like revolutionary politics happening, like where it's the upper higher echelons of like society, kind of like it's a class war essentially in the traditional Marxist sense that we imagine it, the rich people versus the poor people, and that would have been like so simple, right? But that doesn't actually happen because there is because imperialism happens at like two levels. Like one is at the level of administration, but the other is at the level of like kind of like protection and guarding as well. And like people who do not have access to getting social status through education, or I mean, not that they can't, but that the barrier of entry is like so much higher, and like there are factors where you just don't fit in. Like you're not even allowed access into those things through various things, from the way that you speak to the way that you dress and the way that you behave and all of that. Like there are many social barriers to climbing up the ladder, and the military then becomes like the easiest way to achieve a similar sort of like a social status. And that also sort of ties into the broader authoritarian ideal, like where you might say that like, hey, people from these particular social groups should not be so much pro authoritarianism, but because they are the people who are suffering under the authoritarian rule of the government. Like they are the people who where the police come and like take them away in the middle of the night, and all of these things are like kind of happening. But the only way for them to kind of like raise themselves out of that kind of a status is to enlist their children or themselves in the military, which is once again a very authoritarian enterprise, like which runs by the same kind of like authority, which kind of like valorizes an authoritarian way of life as a kind of upliftment of self, so much so that it's also a spiritual calling, like where you discipline yourself the way you discipline your society and the way you discipline, this is sort of the essence of patriarchy as well, that the rule of the parent, the rule of the father, and like the rule of the mind over the body. Like at every point of time there is a male entity, male spirit, that is guarding and protecting and conditioning the female spirit. Like like this sort of like an idea sort of gets formed because of the material conditions, which which kind of like make sure that the only way for social progress for depressed classes is through the acceptance of authoritarian roles, whether you join the police, whether you join the army, or whether you join the administrative services. Like once again, like what you are taught is that you if you are suffering under authority, then capture that authority, and then and then things will be okay.
It's no accident that, I think generally speaking, like people who join the military in disproportionate amounts tend to come from more the conservative side of the political spectrum for a lot of these reasons, natural hierarchy, and like we have to have the strong rule of law, we have to have order and discipline in how we understand where we live and who we are.
you can be like, for instance, like you can be treated as a equal member of society, like say, um, like through education, but that's such a high barrier because like education involves all of the kind of resources that you already do not have access to. So then you have like arts and sports, which kind of like tend to be a little more accessible, but at the same time they come with their own cultural trappings of like, how you look, how you dress, like how good you are, like unless you have really like sort of like cracked it in terms of like being the absolute best, like you can't climb up those ladders. But so like as you keep sort of looking at these like various barriers of entry, like the thing that becomes most uh, sort of lucrative to kind of enter is again like military forces, because unfortunately like a country is always short on military supply, and like country always wants young people who are willing to sacrifice themselves, and like that becomes an easy way of acquiring status, acquiring respect for your family, acquiring like good jobs that have like pensions, that have like good benefits and all that. Like so, like this, the sort of social pride and material reality are kind of like combined in this like one capsule when it comes to joining authoritarian regimes as part of the infantry as far as foot soldiers to that group.
To this point about the sort of people from these, very impoverished backgrounds who disproportionately, let's say, serve in the military, I want to delve a little bit more into the Bahujan Samaj Party, if the BSP, and how they factor into this. Because if their whole focus is we are a party for generally speaking, historically and currently impoverished people from lower class backgrounds, like how do they fit into this equation of their approach to the world and what kind of stuff they're about?
They have a problem of not having this national level media access that BJP and Congress have access to. They have their people like the I think Congress and BJP cultural mainstream narratives get disseminated across the country in much more traditional ways because their people are already there as parts of the media and all that. Like even for me as a journalist, like I find it very hard to kind of like get a sense of like where is it that BSP party is at any given point of time. I can get a sense of it from uh, what their national leaders are saying at any given moment, but there is a lot of cultural nuance to that. Like I would never, for instance, like just take Modi's word and then say like, oh, that applies to all of BJP, or I wouldn't just take like say Rahul Gandhi's word and then say that applies to all of Congress. I'll keep my ears open for all of the other undercurrents and like all of the other voices and all that, right? Like, and that becomes that much harder for me if I'm looking at a political party like the PSP. Like, I need to be like very culturally tuned to it. Like, which I'm sorry to say, I'm not very much. Like, I do tend to keep abreast of like their politics, and I do tend to understand that what BSP has at this point is kind of like a larger uh, moral imperative in the conditions of the Bahujans or in the conditions of the working class, because um, the word of BSP leaders is still considered pretty is sort of looked at with respect in the larger Bahujan community and all that. Like, but at the regional level, what happens is that there are local Dalit parties which are much more in tune with the material demands of the people and all that. Like, and in many cases, it might be that the BSP and the local Dalit party, although they might both be working towards the same cause in the broader sense. Like they might not be politically aligned on these sort of ideas and all that. Like, but yes, I think again, long story short, like what we would want to say about the difference between these larger political parties and like say BSP is can also be described along the lines of so let's say like agriculture is one of the largest sectors, like economic sectors in India, and then in agriculture, like you inevitably have like the difference between like who is the person who owns land and who is the person who kills the land, right? Like so you have like the difference between the landowners and the farm hands, essentially. So Congress party tends to be, or like broader like majority parties tend to be more along the lines of like landowners, farmers, large farmers, and their interests. And Bahujan parties are sort of coming in with the interests of um, farm hands as well as small farmers, like people who don't own say more than like 1 or 2 acres of like farmland, who are just about able to grow like one crop, and like subsistence farmers, so to speak. Their interests once again tend to be very different, because on the one hand, um, the landowning farmers are talking about the loans that they acquire from the government and from larger banks, and sort of like these legitimized and regulated bodies. And these are the people they're sort of getting loans from to like buy, and then like when they have droughts and all that, like these are the people they become answerable to. And the problem over there, like once again, is about debt securitization, where their debts are sold off to other organizations, which then come and try to enforce those debts from them, and so on and so forth. Like you have like all of those problems of like like what is the selling price at which I can sell my produce? What is the rate of interest of my loan, and all of that. And like these negotiations are taking place at like a more formal level. And then you have the concerns of the farm hands and like people who work in the small farms, who are actually like who don't even have access to loans from recognized institutions, like not from banks, not from like like larger groups and all that, but they're borrowing money from money lenders, from unregulated economies, like where it is not so much a question of like like their concern is not like what is the rate of interest that the government is setting for like a particular loan, because whatever the formal rate of interest is set by the government, like that doesn't apply to them, because they're still like earning, they're still loaning money, or like they're still like borrowing money from money lenders who can pretty much like it's just like a interpersonal negotiation. The more desperate you are for credit, like the more like unreasonable the creditors demands can be or tend to be. So the material reality, so even if you call like both set of people like farmers, the material realities of like both set of farmers like differ. And this is broadly like where I see like like is it a political party that supports the factory owner who also has his own grievances, or does it support the factory workers who also have their own set of like grievances? And like does it support the farm landowner who have their own set of grievances, or is it the farm hands who have a set of grievances against the farm owners, so to speak? Like, so this is the kind of like broader division that has been like the Bahujan parties and the non-Bahujan parties, which is that both of them at the end of the day are fighting for the broad umbrella being the same, but there is the material reality the where the higher classes are kind of like fighting the government and the system more directly, but the lower classes are kind of fighting like not just the government and the system, but also the people above them.
It's a party that is much more concerned with, shall I say, the domestic economic realities of people in lower class positions. It's a lot less concerned with what is our diplomatic relationship with China, the United States, and Brazil or something. It's like,
Yeah, I think like it fits very well with what you're saying, because like now that you say it, it reminds me that the leader of the Bahujan Samaj Party, the BSP, is a woman, Mayawati, a Dalit woman, and like again, like her rhetoric does not tend to be along the lines of say like whether it's the BJP that's talking about like some Islamic invasions, or there's the Indian National Congress and like them talking about British colonialism. Like that is definitely like uh, the BSP doesn't have to reach that far for a revolution, right? Like they are able to talk like much more along the lines of the material realities of the present day. So like they tend to not discuss, and also like they uh, being from a minority class or like from a depressed class, like they tend to not have a very idealized version of the past. So that way the politics tends to be a little more like different, a little more refreshing, so to speak, like when it comes to like the Bahujan politics in India. Bahujan politics in India tends to be much more present, but much more material compared to other.
it's a lot less grand narratives about, yeah, like our history and who we've decided the villain is and who the hero is and how we're going to build our government in the direction of whatever we view as the correct like the true India that we want to for. It's like, okay, these people need better economic circumstances. What are we doing at a local level to help them?
Yeah, exactly. Like the loans work very differently for rich people versus poor people. Like where like you have, and this is a very um, you know apparently an American proverb that goes, if you owe the bank $100,000, the bank owns you. But if you owe the bank $100 million, then you own the bank. And this is really
Yep.
the difference between
Yep.
rich
I've
people.
heard I've heard that proverb before. Yeah.
So that's essentially sort of what happens here as well. Like that, people who are thinking about like the broader economic processes and all that are able to speak at that level, like because them borrowing huge sums of money is looked at to be in the interest of the broader development of the country. But people who are taking petty loans, the people who are taking loans, borrowing money to literally like subsist, those loans are like kind of like looked down upon, like both in terms of like status, that hey, this is a desperate person taking a desperate loan, and secondly, it is somehow like never tied to nation building. We never think that uh, a farm hand taking like a small loan to, I don't know, like buy a motorbike to go more easily to their farm, like that this loan suddenly like tends not to be in the interest of nation building. Some other like agriculturist who wants to like take like 100 crore loans to set up a tractor business or like a farming technology business in India, like that person is definitely kind of like working towards nation building, right? Like, but this guy like who just wants to buy a motorbike to access the fields like more easily, like that is never thought about in terms of like nation building. And like the higher loans, there is value to them being written off, because like say you write off those loans, then that is in the interest of like nation building. But like this guy, don't write off his motorcycle loan because it's like his motorcycle, like he is individually responsible for that like one motorcycle, like whereas like a tractor company is for the whole country.
It's so interesting because it does get to that. I could just see how people in politics are thinking like the grand building of the nation must be, these farms and these big factories and all of this. But the daily life elements, which are important in growing an economy, often fall by the wayside because they don't look as impressive in some video that we can film of like, look at all of the fields that we have with all of this new machinery, even if like the people are maybe struggling to commute there, because it's not fancy to think about, okay, well, like, yeah, they all need motorbikes or they all need to like ride share together. That doesn't make it into the movie about our glorious nation and how powerful we're going to be.
Interesting, like brings us back to the broader question that we brought up in the beginning about like neoliberalism. And in this particular context, like say me as a politician, I had the ability to sort of like come to power, like come to the center, and then say like, hey, what I'm going to do is I'm not going to focus so much on like whatever like technology and all of this stuff, like because like we've had a lot of that, and then like this particular 5 years that I'm planning for, I'm going to make sure that like most of the money is like spent in like public health, public infrastructure, like canceling some petty loans, like not canceling the canceling like larger like bank level loans or like industry level loans, but like I'm just going to like give like petty loan relief to like a lot of people. Like these are the kind of things that are like extremely populist. Like I can, I mean, like I'm willing to stake my uh, money and reputation on the fact that like if there were to be any politicians who were to make these sort of like reforms, they would definitely kill it in the elections, and like they would like really like have good chances of coming back to power as well. Like, but they cannot do that because again of what we call as like debt restructuring. Like it is not within the hands of political power. It is not within the hands of politicians to sort of say X amount of like the country's budget would go into public spending, because the because again like the broader thrust of Washington consensus policies is around um, debt repayment. One, it is in investing within investments, and this once again comes back to a question of like, do you believe in like left wing economic policies, or do you believe in the more neoclassical economic policy style, like where left wing economic policies tend to be rated more on spending. The idea is you give people money, give people who can spend money to spend, and then like that will take care of the economy in itself. Whereas the other view sort of says that give money to the people who are building the economy at a larger infrastructural level, and like that will sort of and that money will sort of like trickle down, and so that's again once again the
Yeah, so
broader
trickle down economics.
it's trickle down economics, or are you talking about trickle up economics? Because trickle up economics is something that we like don't talk about, but trickle up economics basically means that if there is somebody who is desperate to buy something and doesn't have the money to do so, then it is always a very safe idea to just print money and give it to him, because like that guy is just going to spend it. And once the money is spent, it comes back into economic circulation, and that's going to like sort of expand the economy. That's sort of your more left wing style economic ideas. But your more conservative or classical style economic ideas is no, spending is not really the issue. The issue is investment. So give money to the person who is more likely to invest in some kind of like infrastructure that will progress the nation. I was in the US from 2019 to 21 during the pandemic years, and like I got to see the like I was here during the Black Lives Matters protests, and then like that sort of like goes into this
Oh
COVID.
yeah, yeah. Oh yeah. 2020 was it was an action packed year. I tell you, 2020 in the U.S.
So yeah, and including the election and all of that I was there for, and like it sort of made me feel that there were many interesting ideas that came up from the left during the elections. I was seeing the Democratic primaries and all that for the first time, and I felt like the Democratic primaries were like built in a way where there were certain periods of time where the race for the primary is like not really hotting up. It's like sort of slowly building, where more radical ideas can kind of like exist, and like these radical ideas get a lot of traction and people are talking about it. And then there are these kind of like Super Tuesday, or like like where all of these primaries are supposed to lead up to some point where you decide who is going to be your leader, and at that point like all the radical ideas kind of like sort of fall by the wayside, and like only the most conservative amongst the radical ideas kind of like make it to the front. And then like you have say like Biden and Kamala Harris sort of like moving to the front, and people like Bernie sort of like falling back, even though from a broader like popular standpoint, like it seemed like Bernie was making steady ground, and like like his ideas were gaining traction. But like suddenly when it came to who is it that's going to be the representative, like that is when the more radical people sort of like fall by the wayside, and like the more conservative or traditional elements within the party kind of like make it to the thing. So that is one of the things that I had observed, like which is why I sort of wonder that like like even if say something like Andrew Yang said something, and like that kind of like had its brief moment in the sun, but did not kind of like find its wings. I wonder, did it not find its wings because people are not so interested, or is it just the structure of politics such that at some point the radical ideas have to kind of like yeah.
I am increasingly just of the mindset, and I think many people are in the U.S., that it is the machinery of the two-party system and the institutional power that is so deep with both of those parties and the machines that run it, that you can't break in. No, like like I hate Bernie Sanders or anything, but I was never like a huge Bernie supporter. But one claim I think that was legitimate that a lot of people from his team made was this idea of like there's a lot of people behind him, but nothing's really ever kind of breaking through. Though of course the counterpoint to that being Donald J. Trump, and that there has been a tremendous shock to the system in some ways, through especially I think his second term. The sense of there is just so much institutionalized power and weight that just it does not go anywhere, that just sits there in Washington, is a very common critique from I think people pretty much all over now. In many ways I think almost a very unifying aspect of people's discontent in the US.
This was the kind of like unifying factor across like party lines. This is again like something that I personally experienced when I was there in the US, which was very different from what I experienced here in India. Is this kind of like a unifying realization, or kind of like an understanding that like like okay, fine, we might have our political differences personally, we might vote for different people and all that, but we all kind of agree that that is the problem, like like that there is this one static entity where which needs to revolutionize for any sort of a change to happen, but that is what is not changing. And in a sense, like a lot of people clearly felt that Trump is the kind of like he's also not a Republican insider and all, right? And like he might be the person to break that logjam or like something
That's
like that.
right. That's right. He's not. He's not. It is very much. It's very palpable in Europe, increasingly in a lot of European countries. That sense of, your country is secretly just being run by this kind of EU globalist cabal, and which is a big reason for the rise of these, like, we will say kind of right wing nationalist parties. To bring it back to India, I'm curious. Are there other dynamics at play? How do people see these parties, and how is the information being conveyed? Because you also mentioned that too, like the information, like what do you see on TV? What do you see in social media? I don't want to say the branding, but like the public image that's being put out.
Indian National Congress is a party that has a lot of political history, especially with regards to the Indian freedom struggle. So, which is also a very good reason why they would like to stick a lot more to the conversation about like colonialism and British imperialism, because that is where they took a stand and that is where they fought. And during the same time, the Hindu Mahasabha, the RSS, like the organizations that are like more associated with BJP right now, like they were more interested in sort of policy level changes that would benefit them more. So they were more negotiating state with the British imperialist government, like whereas the Indian National Congress as well as the Communist Party and others were kind of like in direct opposition. They were like not trying to they were trying to fight for reforms, but on a much more extremist scale. Or in many cases, they were not even like fighting for reforms. They were simply like, like get the hell out and like we want to form our government kind of a thing. So that kind of continues even today, like where Indian National Congress like definitely like does get its respect from the fact that like it it is house to many of the freedom fighters of the past, like all of the founding fathers of the nation, like overwhelmingly tend to come from the Congress party. So that generally tends to be the line still today. I think a person who is more moderate about politics, who is probably not very politically active, but but does see it as their right or their duty to kind of like go and vote and like participate to the extent possible in the politics of the country. Like they would probably tend to vote for the Indian National Congress, like because it is like the more moderate party. And again, like once again, like if there is um BJP taking on a very overt Hindutva or like a Hindu nationalist position, um, the Congress will not automatically oppose that, because they are in no way trying to subvert the broader Hindu nationalist agenda or like something. Like many of the Congress leaders themselves tend to be part of the RSS or like tend to be sympathizers of the broader Hindu nationalist agenda and all of that. Like so that is typically like I don't think they would find like all party resonance, nor would they find it like very politically lucrative to take those sort of like hard stances. They tend to take like much softer stances on most of the issues, and they tend to speak more along the lines of empowerment. They talk a lot about like women's empowerment. They talk a lot about uh, empowerment of like minority groups and all that. Like they tend to not be very they tend to be like very soft. I don't think the cultural politics of the country sort of like allows anybody to sort of like openly come out and like be supportive of LGBTQI rights the way it is in the US. But at least like the Indian National Congress
Yeah,
like
sure.
it does not tend to take any strong positions against it, and like individual leaders within the party can feel very free to openly support, queer rights and minority rights and all that.
I have a quick side related question, which is the Indian National Congress's view on Islam and Islamic conquest, like versus the British, because and I'm just going off of like the U.S. framework here, but when it comes to, let's say, the Democrats, it's very much the people that we collectively view as, quote, not the conservative, like, white men that live in the country that ran stuff. Like, we're the everyone else team. But it's become more extreme, I think, in both directions, like, as time has gone on. But with the Indian National Congress, you mentioned, it's a little bit more subsumed. It's a little bit more subtle. You have people who are in it who are, like, yep, we're practicing Hindus and we're very much on board with that. I'm curious how, again, the Islam and Islamic history narrative factors into the Indian National Congress.
Again, like the way it was narrativized to us, like when we were growing up and all that, was there was a simple enough explanation that made a lot of sense to a lot of us, like, which is that the Britishers, we call British colonialism as colonialism simply because, like, the Britishers lived in Britain, like the government rule was happening from London, like the monarchy was situated in London. But if you look at Islamic rule, if you want to call it that, like, was essentially, sure, the king might have had a Islamic identity, like might come from like an Islamic heritage, but the point is, like, they lived and worked out of India, like they were administering India as a nation with their fortunes tied very much to the health of the country, whereas Britishers, for instance, like, can cause drought in Bengal, a famine in Bengal, and then reap its benefits in England through a shortage of, like, through the falling of, like, various other agricultural prices, like where they buy more, like land prices fall, and then, like, kind of swoop in and, like, buy more land. Like, somebody like India's material misery can benefit Britain in a very real way. And that was not so for the so-called Islamic conquerors, because, like, they ultimately came to India and they set up shop in India, and, like, they became part of India. There's this thing, like, where any misfortune in their kingdom is misfortune to themselves. Like, there is no other, like, external entity kind of, like, profiting off of like, misery that they create in a particular land. Like, so that generally tended to be the position of the Indian National Congress, as well as a lot of our textbooks when we were growing up. The fact that, like, hey, yes, these people are Muslim kings and, like, all of that, like, but their prime minister is a Hindu, like their entire courtiers are, like, Hindus, like they had, like, such good relationships with, like, other Hindu kings and all of that. So really, like, thinking about these things on, like, religious lines, like, does not tend to make a lot of sense from a historical point of view. And in a very real sense, like, um, the effectiveness of this narrative, or the effectiveness in propagating this narrative, also in a very real way led to the fueling of the counter narrative, saying that, like, hey, like, look at all of these, like, elites who are trying to tell you that, like, like, oh, the Muslims were all very nice. Like, oh, if they were so nice, like, how come they destroyed so many temples? If they were so nice, like, how come they converted so many people to their religion, and so on and so forth? And, like, so these sort of both of these ideas sort of tend to exist in tension with each other.
Yeah, that's interesting because, especially, I think, in the last 25 years, in Western countries, that's very much the split on the topic of Islam, in terms of, generally, the parties that are going to be left of center are going to be more like, our main culprit in the historical narrative is European imperialism, and the parties that are going to be more to the right of center are more like, the culprit is Islamic imperialism. And it's rare, I think, even in Western countries, to see people who take in either, like, hey, they were all bad, or, like, hey, they were all fine. It tends to, and I'm speaking generally here, but there's more than enough evidence, I think, based on the party you're talking about, where, like, that is very much how the narratives play out if you're on team left or team right, which seems to line up very closely then with kind of how it is in India.
Yes, yes, yes. That tends to be like the broader Islamic question, like whether it was the I think, like in the US, like, there is no question of Islamic conquest in the past, or like something like that. Like, that is not very much issue, but
No, for sure, in terms of the history, it's more, I think, with the U.S., the idea of not even the foreign wars necessarily, but this general sense of, like, antipathy from the Muslim world in the current state. If I think about someone like Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense, and like some of the people on the side of Trump, there's a very clear line there of like, yeah, no, the bad guys, it's Islam. And then there's very much a clear through line for people on the left of like, Muslims like are part of our community and like Trump's, a fascist. Like that through line still plays through with a lot of the current state of affairs, and very much same thing with Europe, with the whole situation with immigration there, since so much of that is from Muslim countries. There's that same breakthrough of like, are we on the like we're a diverse group of humans and we want people of different backgrounds versus there's this thing called Islamic imperialism that's been surgically removed from our history textbooks by these people on the left because they want to tell us a narrative that's actually like dangerously untrue. And that same split, it seems like you could put that pretty clearly on India as well in how Indian National Congress versus BJP are approaching this topic. I'm curious, anything that you're particularly optimistic about and anything that you're particularly worried about as you think about the future and you think about potential opportunities, but also dangers on the horizon.
History is something that is like extremely like varied and something that's happened in the past, and like we cannot possibly like not even the best historian or like not the most well-rounded scholar can really get a complete sense of like history, and history also tends to be like driven across like time and space, and completely contradictory things are happening at like the various points of time and various times points spaces, and like so this larger Indian trend of like keeping history as some kind of a marker for how we're going to see our future, like that is definitely a very worrying trend, because then like because a focus on that is very rarely a focus away from our material conditions today, which are like the more reliable markers of like what kind of a future we want or we desire. When I was growing up, like it used to feel like like the conversation was more around like, oh, people are getting so westernized, like that we are forgetting our own culture and like all of that, and like now suddenly it's like, hey, maybe we didn't actually forget our culture. Like our culture was all fine, but like there was this narrative going on that like, hey, you're forgetting your culture is getting eroded, and therefore, and then suddenly like now we find ourselves in this like very almost like, let's say, like proto-fascist sort of like a situation. That is my broader worry, that despite despite us coming to this head in the present day, like the fascination with history or like fascination with trying to secure our futures through like looking way past into the history, like that has not really changed, and like that is maybe a sense of worry that I have. But the thing that I'm really, really optimistic about is like, I had mentioned before that BJP or Indian National Congress, like they have, when they have a particular agenda that they want to like sort of disseminate, the national media structures are already built for them to like sort of propagate those messages, so that like even a regular like casual political observer like myself is able to kind of like draw some broad inferences. Like whereas once it comes to like PSP or like other parties, like the more marginalized groups, like there isn't a media that is like set in place to kind of like disseminate that information, which is changing with the internet now. um, Reels, uh, TikToks, like like podcasts, just online media that is being like created, which speaks specifically to issues of the oppressed classes, like which speaks specifically to Dalit issues, which speaks specifically to Bahujan issues. Like all of these things have become part of mainstream media now, and earlier there would have been like so many various like barriers of entry to doing that. Like whereas now, in a sense, like popularity is the only barrier of entry. Like as long as you have like 100,000 viewers from your own community, there is no one that can stop you. Like because like suddenly like there are economic factors at play. Like there's YouTube and Facebook sort of swooping in and giving these people money and like sort of promoting them and all that. Like, and of course, like there is also like the Indian government then sort of like trying to sort of control how Twitter or like Facebook or like Instagram, like any of these, like they've banned TikTok in India. Like yes, there is pressure from the government side and all that. Like, but in a sense, the growing um, left wing conversation and the way the left wing conversation is being shaped by minority voices, which suddenly are able to sort of speak unencumbered in the internet space. That I think is like something very positive.
Well, Satwik Gade, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. For everybody who made it this far, thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and leave a comment if you'd like. Just be, respectful as always. And we will see you next time. Satwik, it was a pleasure. Thank you.